Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Westminster College and tonight's B.W. Bastian Foundation Diversity Lecture Series event, our concluding highlight of this year's Martin Luther King Jr. Celebration Week. So in just a few moments, we will hear from our keynote speaker for tonight's talk around the theme, Bodies on the Line. I'm Dr. Tamara Stevenson. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I serve as the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer here at Westminster. This year's Martin Luther King Jr. Celebration Week theme, Bodies on the Line, is inspired by dance artist, educator, and Westminster dance professor and dance program chair, Megan Wall. Yes. Whose scholarly and creative focus is on healing-centered and equity-oriented methods of training the body toward performance, and her advocacy for access to dance across a spectrum of dancing bodies. With last fall's opening of the Gilmore Performing Arts Complex, our newest building on campus, which is attached to this building, in the home of our dance program, it was an intriguing brainstorm to explore how to intersect the notion of movement as both a force of resistance and healing for individual and collective social justice. So I'd like to briefly recognize those in the audience with us whose presence, leadership, and support make this event possible, and more so, to provide and protect the creative space that allows me to do what I love to do in my role as Chief Diversity Officer here at Westminster. I cannot start this long, it's not gonna be long, but it could be long, list without acknowledging President Beth Dobkin. She's right here on the second row. She always makes time to be across the campus, but with particular attention to demonstrating and modeling her commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion at this institution and in the way she approaches her leadership. So thank you, continued thanks for supporting me. We have board members with us tonight as well, again, modeling that commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion at that board level. And I'd like to acknowledge Board Chair Preston Chiaro. And he actually gets two acknowledgments because I didn't get a chance to do that at the Unity Luncheon last week or a couple of weeks ago. So I'm glad he was here tonight to be able to do that. So thank you for being here. And our chair of our Board of Trustees, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, Robert Rendon, he's over there. Again, always showing up and supporting our efforts here. I have some special guests in the audience whose lives and careers are just so busy, but they just continue to show up for me whenever I ask. And I have to start with my mentor, probably one of the biggest reasons I'm here in Utah, and he is Dr. William Smith. He's just in the back, so just ask him to wave. He has so many titles. But he is the founding scholar of racial battle fatigue, and I use that framework in my doctoral study, and he is now with the Huntsman Mental Health Institute, doing great things with extending his framework there. Dr. Oscar and Dr. Jackie Moses, pastors of Utah's historic Calvary Baptist Church, are here with us tonight, so thank you for coming. And I know, and if I pulled in my church protocol, there's this phrase where we say something like, we don't know who to call, but you can call yourself to acknowledge that you are here in the house tonight. So give yourselves a hand for being here. Also, one more thing, campus leadership. My cabinet colleagues, our provost, our dean of students, our chief human resources officer, and I don't want to keep calling names because I will get in trouble. So thank you all again for being here. Let's take a collective pause to recognize the tribal communities of the Goshute, Dine, Navajo, Paiute, Shoshone, and Ute peoples, their elders, both past and present, and their future generations. We acknowledge their stewardship of Utah's lands. So today is also the first day of Black History Month. So here is your Black History fun fact. Tonight's speaker is a member of a Divine Nine fraternity, Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated. So what is the Divine Nine? I am glad you asked. So at the start of the 20th century, a small number of Black students came together from primarily historically Black colleges and universities to form their own sororities and fraternities in a similar fashion as the social Greek organizations formed a century earlier on historically white campuses. And they were often highly exclusive and barred membership to students of certain genders and races, especially Black students. These organizations are known collectively as the National Pan-Hellenic Council or the Divine Nine. Each of these organizations, 5 fraternities and 4 sororities, were established with unique core values but shared a common goal: to educate and uplift the Black community from racial inequity. So there are some members of the Divine Nine in the room tonight, so let us know how you are here in your own special way. All right, I love it. Please help me acknowledge the signature sponsor of Westminster's Diversity Lecture Series, the B.W. Bastian Foundation. This foundation supports local and national institutions that benefit, encourage, and preserve the rights of individuals, promote equity for the LGBTQIA+ community, and support for HIV/AIDS programs. So on behalf of the college, I thank the B.W. Bastian Foundation for their longtime partnership with Westminster to make this diversity lecture series possible. I also extend gratitude to the following organizations for their partnering sponsorships of our diversity lecture series, along with the Bastian Foundation. So Mark Miller Subaru, Zions Bank, the Utah Department of Cultural and Community Engagement, BW Productions, and Rocky Mountain Power Foundation. Thank you. You should have received a tear-off sheet, a sheet that you can tear off to give us some feedback on tonight's event. You're welcome to even write some notes down on the back of that page, but tear off the corner that best represents your experience at this event tonight. Now, to the introduction of our keynote speaker. It has been a pleasure to meet Michael in person. I follow his social media, podcast. I'm waiting to pre-order his book. And I appreciate his sense of humor and passionate approach to examining social issues that impact Black folks and Black communities. It took two students will introduce the keynote. Nicholas Lockhart Allen is a senior graduating in a couple of months, studying public health, and Rachel Tuttle is a sophomore/junior studying psychology. Please welcome Nicholas and Rachel to the podium.
Hello and welcome, everyone. We are so excited to be here, and we are so excited for you all to be here to hear the words of Michael Harriet. We actually had the chance to have an intimate lunch with him today, and it was an absolute pleasure. So we are absolutely honored and blessed and very grateful to have him here on campus today.
Michael Harriet is a columnist at The Griot and a staff writer on The Amber Ruffin Show. His work has appeared in The Washington Post, The Atlantic, NBC, BET, and on his mother's refrigerator. He is a frequent political commentator on MSNBC and CNN, and earned the National Association of Black Journalists Award for digital commentary as well as TV news writing.
Just going to switch around, guys. Known for his acerbic wit, biting commentary, and investigative reporting, Harriet's work has influenced presidential politics and pop culture. He originated the phrase "invited to the cookout," and his social media posts contextualizing history are shared by millions.
He served as the sole writer for BET's midterm election special, as well as Young, Gifted, and Broke, an examination of the student debt crisis. Although he has jokingly billed himself as a white apologist, For years, Michael Eric Dyson hails him as one of the funniest men out there, taking no prisoners on the subject of white supremacy. As a performance poet, Michael has traveled across the country performing his unique blend of comedic verse.
Michael earned degrees in mass communications and history from Auburn University and earned a master's degree in macroeconomics and international business from Florida State University. He also won the 2019 Association of Black Journalists Award for digital commentary, but he considers his biggest accomplishment to be the fact that Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, and the National Rifle Association have all publicly expressed disdain for him.
And without further ado, welcome Michael Harriet.
Thank you. If I'm terrible, I'll remember this applause and not the last one. It's great to be here in the state. This is my first time in the state of Utah. And I wish I would have given you some advance. You could have done something about the cold. It is much colder than I could have even imagined. But then again, it is February. But yeah, so it's great to be here. Great to find. This place is so beautiful. This city, this state. I told somebody it's like when you see a science fiction movie, and you kind of know the background is CGI. They painted, they photoshopped it, but it still looks kind of real. Like you guys did a really good job with this landscape in Salt Lake City. It really looks like there's mountains right there. Great CGI job. But today, I'm happy to be here, happy to talk to you about, Black history, Martin Luther King, and Black people in general. When we think about Martin Luther King, we kind of have already accepted him as an American hero, and I always like to point out that Martin Luther King had never had a positive favorability rating during his life. He was mostly despised by most Americans. And, in 65, a Gallup poll found 85% of Americans believe communists were in the civil rights movement. The FBI was investigating him. Only 36% of white Americans believe that King had, quote, helped the Negro cause. So whenever I start these kinds of talks, I have to point out that we have to begin with the understanding that there have never been a movement for freedom and equality for any non-white people in America that has been accepted. Not the abolition movement, not the anti-lynching movement, not the integration or civil rights movement, not Black Lives Matter. So we have to start there to understand that just talking about this is deemed controversial. Now, it's not like when Black people are at barbershops and churches and at their mama's Thanksgiving table, these issues, it's not controversial because it is a reality that we live with every day. So even the idea that is controversial is centered in that same white narrative that we have accepted as the default. And I know even to me, I understand that it makes people cringe when, even using the words white people, right? Like I can be a Black writer and a person who talks on Black History Month. And it's because of what I call the privilege of individuality, right? When I do something, I know, even if it is subconsciously, that my actions will reflect on all of the Black people who aren't even associated with me. And white people get to be individuals. They get to be, what you do and how you act and how you dance and how you wash your legs is an individual thing. And it's not you don't have to be burdened with the responsibility of representing a collective group of people. It's the privilege of individuality. And if we interrogate that idea even further, we see that when we call what we call the civil rights movement or black movements in general aren't really movements, right? Like we talk about civil rights. Who doesn't want to be free, right? So the efforts that we collectively pool to affect our freedom isn't really a movement, because America was founded on the idea that freedom, liberty, is the natural state of man, right? Like, you know, we hope there's only three things that we declared when we started this experiment in democracy. All men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? So from birth, when God conceived of man, he endowed us with the pursuit of happiness. To collectively fight for that is not a movement. We're all born with it. The reason we look at it as a movement is because of who has power and who doesn't. And I would even say that if the natural state of man is freedom, then the obstruction of that freedom is a movement more so than the quest for liberty, right? And to look at anti-blackness, to look at white supremacy, to look at the obstruction as a movement is something that we never talk about because of the privilege of individuality. The guy who shot Martin Luther King is seen as a guy who shot Martin Luther King, even though most of white America hated him. How insane is that idea, right? Like to think that he did what not necessarily a lot of most white people wanted to kill him, but they did not like his ideas. So to think that Martin Luther King was killed by a lone man is the privilege that is afforded to an individual, right? And as a matter of fact, like to explain that, you know, I like to use, and I hate to use profanity, and I understand that this word has become profane across America. But I gotta say it. To understand it, you gotta stay woke. And I know that word woke has become a watchword lately, even though the first time that word we know was ever recorded, because it has been used by black people for more than a century. And in 1938, like in one of the earliest kind of what they call race records, they asked a man named Huddy Leadbelly, they called him Ledbetter, a blues musician, to write a song. And he wrote a song about the Scottsboro Boys. He had met the Scottsboro Boys who were accused of rape, falsely accused of rape, and eventually acquitted. And he had met them, and he made a song called the Scottsboro Boys. And at the end of the song, as you know, it's trailing off, he explains how he wrote the song. He said, I met one of the Scottsboro Boys, and they told me, if you're going down through Alabama, you gotta stay woke. 1946, a few years later, the Negro Mine Workers Union had a strike in West Virginia. And when they were asked by a reporter about what he thought were their efforts of success, were the chances of success, he said, well, they think they're gonna lull us to sleep, but they don't realize we know how to stay woke. Erykah Badu had a hit song about it. Childish Gambino, he had a hit song about it. It was a phrase people used. As a matter of fact, before, I always say before black people started listening to podcasts. I had a podcast with one of my best friends, and just like out of the blue, like in 2015, we had been doing it for 2 years. He called me and said, "Man, we're gonna have to change the name." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because white people just found out about the word, and the name of the show was the Stay Woke Show." So the idea, again, this idea that like there is a movement, like the world is suddenly gone woke, is not true. It is a white movement that has demonized woke. It is the same movement that somehow we abracadabra into a movement of black people that has become woke, when the woke stuff that they're saying, attributing to black people, a movement against Confederate monuments, a movement to teach true history, is not new. Maybe because of social media and the democratization of the internet, people hear it more often because we don't have to live in those ideological bubbles anymore. Which brings me to Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King, if I'm talking about Martin Luther King, I don't quote the "I Have a Dream" speech, because everybody knows one speech. Like, they might know a little bit of the mountaintop speech, but that really wasn't who Martin Luther King was. If you look in the collection of speeches that Martin Luther King has, the most frequent speech he gave, the first time he gave it was in 1958, when he was invited to be the keynote speaker at his alma mater, Morehouse. And he debuted a new speech. And you have to think about it. Martin Luther King was, even though he was kind of reviled, he was famous, right? He spoke on TV and at colleges and universities all of the time. So he couldn't make a new speech every time, right? So he had a collection of speeches, and the one he preferred to use, he debuted in 58 at Morehouse. And it was about staying woke. And I'm not paraphrasing. Literally, his most used speech was called his Remaining Awake speech. He gave it 1 million times, and he's given it so much that you can literally track the progression of Martin Luther King's thinking about the Vietnam War, about civil rights, in the tweaks he made throughout his career to the Remaining Awake speech, right? So he would start off the speech by telling the story of Rip Van Winkle. Now, I'm old, so we know these old stories. But if you don't know the story of Rip Van Winkle was a man who lived in the mountains of West Virginia, got drunk with some guys he met in the woods, fell asleep, woke up 20 years later, and was wondering why everything had changed. And what Martin Luther King pointed out was the story was really about how the world changes and how time passes. But what Martin Luther King would zero in on was when Rip Van Winkle went to sleep, above his bed was a picture of King George III. And when he woke up 20 years later, there was a picture above his bed of George Washington. Rip Van Winkle had slept through a revolution. And when he woke up on election day, and everybody had asked him who he voted for, and he was telling them, I ain't no traitor. I am loyal to my country. I am loyal to King George III. Because he had slept through a great revolution, he didn't even know the principles of democracy had changed. He was still holding on to that old ideology when he was surrounded by a world that offered him more freedom, more prosperity, and he was resistant to it because he had slept through a revolution. He couldn't stay woke. And Rip Van Winkle thought he was wrong because these woke people had started this movement, this unpatriotic movement called America. He believed that because he had slept through a revolution. But he thought that they were the ones who started a movement. And in a sense, that's how we see the world, right? We see the civil rights movement through the eyes of black people resisting, but we don't talk about, just think about how structurally sound, how undefeatable white supremacy must be for people all around this country to have the same idea and to march and die and bloody their skulls for the same freedom and still not be able to get it. They were not the movement. That is the natural state. They are what God created, and there was a movement against them. They were staying woke, and everybody else was asleep. Just think about, when we think about even the idea, I know we've all heard about the Tyree Nichols incident. And I always mention to people that when we hear the phrase abolish the police, it seems like a radical idea because we've all kind of slept through the idea, and we believe that this abolish the police thing is a movement. It's not. If we started from zero today and said, we're going to create a way to enforce the law, and we're going to create a way to solve crimes, and we're going to create a way to protect people, to affect public safety. If I raise my hand and say, hey, why don't we give guns to a bunch of guys with 6 weeks education and then let them figure it out, you would think that was crazy, right? That would be the most insane idea possible. The reason we resist that is because we look at the idea to create something that works as radical, the idea of people wanting to be free as a movement, and say, hey, we don't want to do the work. You're the one with the radical idea. Because we don't stay woke, right? And I'd like, my mom used to always tell me growing up, she used to say 2 words, interrogate yourself. Why are you mad at me? Well, interrogate yourself and see why. Why did that teacher give me a B instead of an interrogate yourself and see if you could have done better? Interrogate yourself. And in a sense, that's what we are all tasked to do as individuals and as a collective. Interrogate yourself to see what movement you're a part of, because you are part of a movement, right? Like if you worked at McDonald's and you knew someone was selling crack cocaine out of the drive-through window, and the police came and questioned everybody there, and you revealed that you knew it, but you remained silent. You didn't say anything about it. You didn't tell anyone. They'd arrest you. Your silence was part of the reason why he was able to sell that crack cocaine out of the drive-through windows. Silence is part of a movement. Inaction is part of a movement because the natural state of man, the natural state of everyone else, is to be free. And if you are not actively, because there are sides, and if you are not on the side of freedom, not only are you part of an anti-freedom movement, if you believe in America and the principles that it stands for, if you believe in that thing that they call the Declaration of Independence, then you must be against the reason God created us. He endowed us with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To obstruct that is not just undemocratic and un-American. According to that definition in that document, it is ungodly. Now, you can choose whether you believe that is based upon the principles that you associate with your religion, but interrogate yourself and see which movement you are a part of. Martin Luther King tailored that speech to say all of the things that he would be reviled for saying right today, right? So in 1964 at Oberlin College, he talked about staying awake, remaining awake, and he used it in the context of American history, but he didn't start it in 1776. He started in 1619. And he said that everyone must share the guilt as individuals and as institutions, institutional racism. 64 at Oberlin College. Southern Methodist University in 66, he began again in 1619 and says, as the first Negro slaves landed on the shores of this nation against their will, thus began an experiment called America. Sounds a lot like critical race theory. And on March 31st, 1968, like this is after the March on Washington, this was after I've been to the mountaintop. He was invited to give a speech to literally the most powerful people in the country. It was at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. It was the last time he would ever preach a sermon in his life. His final speech, he had already given the I Have a Dream speech and the Been to the Mountaintop speech. And when he talked to that group of people at the National Cathedral, it's called the spiritual home of this country. That's what they call the National Cathedral. He decided to give his remaining awake speech. It was all of the things that he had tweaked, he put them in that speech. It was longer than the I Have a Dream speech and the Been to the Mountaintop speech combined. He explained that battling injustice would cause some Americans to lash out against those fighting to live in a free country. Still, he admonished the worshipers to stay woke. And he offered what still stands as the clearest explanation of this entire phenomenon. I say to you that our goal is freedom. And I believe that we are going to get there because however much she strays away from it, the goal of America is freedom. But then he revealed why he believed in that whole remaining awake theory. And he didn't cast it as something that was in his heart about the civil rights movement. He cast it as the movement that was against his freedom. If the inexpressible cruelties of slavery couldn't stop us, the opposition that we now face will surely fail. However dark it is, however deep the angry feelings are, and however violent explosions are, I can still sing, "We Shall Overcome." 4 days after he assured the nation that we shall overcome, a white supremacist put a bullet in his face. So we got to ask ourselves, was he wrong? Well, what's interesting is that when Martin Luther King was killed, there wasn't really like a funeral. Like there were funerals in a bunch of different places. One in Memphis, where he was killed, one in Atlanta, his home. And there was also a funeral with those same powerful legislators at the National Cathedral. It was about 4,000 people there. And when the service was finished and everybody filed out, it was a group of white kids standing outside, and they began singing, "We Shall Overcome." And as they sang it, Coretta Scott King would say she remembered the last word of that remaining awake speech was a quote that he always loved to give. "Truth crushed to the ground will still rise again." And that is the oxymoron of America. The only thing that we can count on is the crushing, not the rising. Because what Martin Luther King told us to do was to stay woke, was to remain awoke, was to not sleep through a great revolution. And the funny part is, we're always in a great revolution until all of us are free. What we're doing is having to choose whether we'll sleep or whether we'll stay woke. Thank you for having me, and I love my time.
So I got several takeaways from tonight, but the three that I think are really profound and I think actually epitomize Dr. King's work and even our theme bodies on the line are: the natural state of man is freedom, human. Interrogate yourself, and one question as part of that interrogation is, what movement are you a part of? So I think you got your money's worth tonight. Please give another hand to Michael Harriet. Thank you for concluding this year's Martin Luther King Jr. Celebration Week. We've had an amazing experience. Thank you for coming out. Be safe as you leave here tonight, and you'll hear more about future events at Westminster. Good night.